My name is Anders Fuhrmann, and I'm an employee here at Issue. And just a short word of who Issue is and why we enjoy hosting this meeting. So Issue, we make a digital publishing platform where we distribute magazines and catalogs over the net and try to digitalize it, bridging paper and digital. So we have more than 50 million magazines and catalogs, more than 100 million readers a month. So quite a large system. We are polyglots here at Issue, so we use all kinds of languages ranging from JavaScript, Python, OCaml, Erlang, Elixir, Kotlin, C++. I actually did not say Haskell, but we could consider it. So in order to have this work, we employ a heterogeneous microservice architecture to handle the scale and volume of this. We started using OCaml at the company in 2011, and we are now currently 6 developers out of 25 who primarily use OCaml to develop the services. So since we started in 2011, the OCaml ecosystem was basically non-existent, but it has since evolved. The package manager, OCaml package manager OPAM, was introduced, and later JBuilder, and then Dune. And this is awesome to start to have real community and real ecosystem around the whole system, which is a segue over to you, Jeremy, on selective functors.
Yeah. So hi everyone, thanks for being here. So my name is Jeremy. I've been doing OCaml for about 13 years now. So the first half of it, I was doing it mostly in open source, just on my free time, while I was studying, and then professionally. In particular, the last 6 years, I've been working at Genstraight, where I continue doing open source, but also I've been working on more private projects. So just in case you don't know it, I'm just going to say 2 words about Genstraight, what we are about. So we are a quantitative trading firm, which means that we use mathematical model to find trading strategy, and then we use software to implement them and automate them. And we put a strong focus on technology. So I would say we consider ourselves as much as a trading firm than a technology firm. And one reason I'm here tonight is because we are the largest user of OCaml. We have hundreds of people writing OCaml every day. We have a code base of millions of lines of OCaml, which is a lot of OCaml. And we do absolutely everything in OCaml, from the trading system, network system, real system, everything is done in OCaml. So we use a lot of things that comes from the OCaml community, like the language, libraries, etc. And we are also a lot invested in open source. So we contribute in various ways. For example, we have people working every day on improving the language itself, who are part of the core development team. We also publish a lot of the software we write in open source. So for example, you have some well-known libraries such as Core, Async, or Base. So these are libraries that we developed internally at Genstraight, and then we publish on our GitHub that I want to use. And finally, we also have projects such as Dune, and we'll talk a bit more about Dune tonight. And these are projects that started internally at Genstraight and that are now developed fully in open source. They are developed entirely on GitHub, and we are just one contributor amongst others of this project. So the last person that came here, Simon, talked about something called selective functor, which are an abstraction to like a way to model computation. So I believe he presented it in a more theoretical way. Me, I'm very much an engineer. I'm interested in practical solution to concrete problems. So I'm going to present it from a much more practical point of view. I'm going to show you basically how I used this abstraction for some real problem I had and how they benefited me. So just to remind a little bit what selective functors are about. So in programming, so in the more, I would say, mathematical side of programming, we have these ways to represent computation. So like, if the logic of your program matches certain laws, you can use one of these abstractions, and that will give you some good properties, etc. that you can use. And, so selective is something quite new, but we have some older ones that have been used and exploited for a long time. So I'm just going to say 2 words about them. First, we have applicative, so it is a way to represent a computation, so describe what your program is doing. And one interesting thing about applicative is that you will know like the structure of your computation, or your computation graph, if you want, beforehand. It's completely static, so it cannot change at runtime. And during execution, all you do is that you follow this graph and you evaluate each node in your graph. So you could imagine if you are like a mathematical expression, with a lot of nodes, and you follow the node and evaluate. But you don't have any decision power at runtime, right? Everything is predetermined, like the structure is determined before, and it's only the value in the node that can change. At the far end, you have monads, which give you a lot of power. That means that at every point in your graph, you can completely change what comes next. So it gives you a lot of decision power. You can completely change the graph during the execution. So as always, when you have all this power, it's a bit easier to program with because you do a bit more what you want. But you get a bit less for your money. Basically, you can't, because at every node you have a function, like that use all the power of your programming language. You can't analyze it. Basically. You can't see past one node that we call a bind, basically, in a monad. So effectively, you can't do any analysis beforehand. On selective, well, they come just in between, basically. It's like a sweet spot in between, where you can make some choice at runtime. You can choose a different branch of execution, but they are all declared beforehand. That means you can still scan everything and make some use of that, but you can make some decision at runtime. And what I'm going to show you tonight is basically like why I needed that and how I benefited from this thing. So to understand all this, I'm going to go back a little bit, a few years. And I'm going to tell you a bit the history of the Dune project, which is where I used selective functor. So I told you earlier that we release a lot of software in open source at GenStreet. And if you go on our GitHub, on github.com/GenStreet, you will see a lot of a small project, so BSCore, etc. Each of these is a small project with a few libraries. It's a small logical entity. And we have about like over 100 packages. I think it's 150 packages nowadays. So all of these can be installed and built separately. So build and install separately. Except that inside GenStreet, that is not at all how we work. Inside GenStreet, we have one single monorepo. So what monorepo, what it is simply like a gigantic repository, source code repository. So we use Mercurial, but some people use Git, etc. And we put all our code inside. And a lot of companies do that, like Google do it, Facebook do it, etc. In general, big companies, they like this because it simplifies a lot the management. You don't have to think about versioning, for example. Like one commit gives you one consistent state of the world, and that's all you need. And in this monorepo, we have like this small library, so BSCore, etc. And one interesting point is that here it's not packages, as I showed you before, like core, I think it's really libraries. Like packages might contain several libraries. Like for example, if you look in Base, you will see the base library, but you will see also the base.yml library, etc. And each of those will contain several libraries. But in the monorepo, we don't see the packages. We only see the library. And this monorepo, it is built with Django. So it's a build system we developed a few years ago. And in fact, if you look, most companies that use a big monorepo, they also developed their own big build system to be able to build this thing and work with it, because you can't use the same tool when you use a project composed of 100 file, and when you use a project composed of 10,000 files. So like the question is now is how we go from there basically to this stage, right? Because since we don't have like all this structure internally, we have to recreate it. When we publish our code, we have to extract some part of it, make sure like we get something that works, like that we don't get like cycle vision packages, etc. And we get something that people can install, like go download and install on their machine. And in particular, they can't use the same tool that we use internally. They can't use Jenga or build system to build it. First of all, because like Jenga is a very, I would say, industrial project. It has a lot of dependency. It's not very portable, etc. On that side, we want people to be able to use like the more common tools that it integrates well with their workflow. So when I started at Gen3, because I had done a lot of open source before, I naturally started looking at this problem. And initially, we were releasing something like 10, 15 packages. And the process of extracting this library, creating packages from it, that was a very, very manual process. So in fact, I think the first public release I did, where I took over code, prepared it, published it, it took me about a month to do. So second, it took a few weeks again. But obviously, I did as any programmer would have done, right? I started automating the process to make my life easier. So I went through several rounds of refactoring, making the process a bit easier. But at the same time, because I was starting to release more often, etc., people at Gen3 also started to want to release more of the libraries they wrote. They were like, well, I wrote this cool thing, can you release it, etc. And before you knew it, I had like 90 to 100 packages to release. So it was painful again. And obviously, like what I was doing essentially is maintain two build systems, right? Because we wanted these packages that we release to, so as I said, to integrate well with the workflow. So we are using what people are using at the time, so my OCaml build, Oasis, etc. And we had to set up this build like when we were doing this release. So we had to set up all the the configuration file, etc. And that was a lot of work. So I don't know if you have ever maintained two build systems, but it is quite a lot of work. Plus, internally, everybody, like at Gen3, everybody uses Linux, the same version, etc. Outside, people use Windows, BSD, etc. Like there are always compatibility problems. So anyway, we did it this way for a few years, and it was painful, but it worked. But at some point, it really became like it was becoming too difficult, And in particular, at some point, I had to write like I didn't know like basically how all these build systems like OCaml build, etc. worked. So for me, they were a bit of a black box, and I thought that was the way to do. Up to the point where I had to write an actual makefile for OCaml, for an OCaml project for Base. And I realized that actually it wasn't that complicated. Like we had all these tools before OCaml, so OCaml build, Oasis, etc. And what they were doing wasn't that complicated. So I thought, why don't I just write my own tool basically to simplify my life, to make this release easier. And the interesting thing is that the unique configuration I needed, like basically if I had written a build for Base, how did I adapt it for core? Like the unique parameters I needed, they were written in this repository, like in a very simple format, in small file called jbuild, that are very similar to the Dune file we have in Dune now. And they were using like a very simple syntax, like S expression, so they were really easy to parse and understand. And so it was basically quite easy to write a tool that would just read this file and produce some OCaml command to compile the project on install it. And that was the initial idea of JBuilder, so it was named after the configuration file. That was just to make it easier to extract something here and build it outside in the open source world. So that was the theory, right? So I started like this for a few weeks, and I quickly realized that it was going to work. But at the same time, I had to make it work for 100 packages. And in these 100 packages, there were already a lot of small specific things to take care of. And so yeah, I quickly knew that it was going to work, but it was going to take me a year to get something ready for production that I could use. And I didn't have a year to spend on it. So I started taking a lot of shortcuts to be able to release something. And there was one problem in particular that for which I took a shortcut by using selective functor, which is the generation of package metadata. So here I told you we have these libraries. And for each of these libraries, we have some metadata that says, for example, core depend on base, core depend on thing, etc. Or base depends on base.camel. But these are library dependency. They are not package dependency. And the package dependency, so it's the same. Before, it's an information I was maintaining manually, but I didn't want it to do that. I wanted it to be generated because it was a lot of things to maintain. And the idea is that, so if you look, so this is like some Dune files, basically, so it's similar to like the JBL file we had in our repository. If you look at these things, you can almost like guess the package dependency from the library dependency. So we're just gonna do it manually, like for the example. So here I have a library called mylib that depends on the library array and LWT. So just by looking at this, I know that the package that contains this library, then surely it will depend on the package that contains this library. But that's not all. Like here, if you look, I also have like a file. So I have a rule. So like this whole thing, it is the way we inject a custom rule into the system. When people have a code generator or something like this, they write this thing to explain to Dune or Django how to generate this file. So let's follow a bit. So here I'm saying that this m.ml is generated by running this program and saving the output in this file. But if I look at what this program is about, so it's defining src gen, I see that it's an executable that depends on library CPX level. Maybe like to generate some OCaml code more easily or something. But now what that means is that if I want to build mylib, then yes, I need array and LWT, but I also need PPX lib because I will need to build the gen that I'm going to use to build m.ml. So if I want to like guess this information by reading the Dune file, I have to basically interpret this library standard, but I also have to interpret all these things and follow correctly the dependency. And here it's not too difficult, but sometimes you might have like several libraries in the same directory, etc. So you also have to understand that this ML file is attached to this library, etc. And when you look at it, a lot of the interpretation you are going to do, it is going to be exactly the same thing as what we did for building the software. When we will build, basically, we have to understand what the library is, etc., how we attach files and to produce like the right OCaml command. And we are going to do something very similar if we want to get the package dependency automatically by reading the Dune file. And as I told you, I was really eager like to go fast and get something released. So I certainly didn't want to have like two very similar interpretations of this file, right? And in particular, I didn't want to have to maintain these two interpretations separately as this small language was evolving, because internally at Genstreet it was evolving as well. So that's why I was looking for an idea to basically share as much code as possible between my build and the generation of package metadata. That's when I remember that there were all these things like applicative, etc., that we could use to essentially describe a computation. So in this case, building a package. And so if I was writing the code this way, then I could reuse the same thing to produce my package metadata. So now I'm going to go a little bit in the technical, like in the internals of Dune. And I'm going to show you how I use basically this abstraction to achieve this basically. So in a nutshell, the way Dune works, so actually that's more like the way it used to work originally. Now it's a bit more complex because we have more advanced features. The way it works is that we have a first pass where Dune will like crawl the file system, like the workspace. It will read all these small Dune files. It will interpret like what the different stanza, like library executable, what they mean. and it will produce a lot of OCaml command to, it will produce a lot of actions, a lot of rules, basically build rules. Build rule in the same sense that Makefile, if you are using Makefile, so list of basically an action plus a list of files that the action will produce, and a list of files the action will read. So this first pass just produce a lot of rules, and then we have a second pass where we just follow this rule basically to build what we want to build. And one thing that's interesting to note is that, like in general, OCaml compilation is complicated. It is complicated for several reasons, but one reason is that the dependency, for example, the dependency, like when you build a library or an executable, the files need to be built in a certain order. So if you have 3 files A, B, C in your library, and file C uses A, then you need to compile A before C. But that is not written anywhere, right? There is not, for example, you could imagine that at the beginning of C, you would say, I'm using A, and the build system will read that and would know to build A before. That's not how we do it. Instead, what we do is that we simply use like A in C, in the code of C, and then we have a tool called OCaml-Dev, that's a dependency analyzer, that will read the file, parse it, and will find all this usage of external module, and will tell, well, I think this file is using A or B, etc. And the build system has to run this dependency analysis, get this dependency, and then order the build accordingly. And what is more, it is not, because you could imagine that the build system would run this by itself, the special case. But very often in OCaml, we also use a lot of code generators. We have Lexer generator, parser generator. We use a lot of PPX rewriter. And the dependency analysis has to be done after this code generation phase. So what that means is that you have a lot of staging in your build. So you can't write like a good build system for OCaml with something like very simple. Like that's why basically like Makefiles for OCaml project are hard to write because you have all this staging. And oh yeah.
So when you build this dependency graph, how do you know which version of the library you should use? Because that information normally doesn't get specified into the code files, right?
So I didn't catch which.
So you pass the files to see which kind of external modules they're calling, right?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing they can have different versions, right? Version 1 or version 2 and so on.
So when you use a library, an external library?
Yeah. So how do you infer that information from the source code? You cannot do that, right?
No, basically, like we don't support multiple versions in OCaml. So at the moment, you just you can have only one version of a library installed. There are actually some people working on namespaces, and we are hoping that maybe namespaces will allow to have several versions installed, etc. But at the moment, it's. I suppose like if you want to have several versions, first of all, you need to have sorted all these problems. Yeah. And a couple of years ago, they were not sorted at all. So now that I think we have mostly sorted them, maybe we can start thinking about the next step. So yes, indeed, that's why, because OCaml compilation is complicated, you need in general more advanced technology to build a OCaml project. And well, this staging, basically, it needs to be represented in the system that we have here, right? Because when I generate the rule, here I say that, a rule, it's a list of dependency. So it's a list of dependency, list of targets on an action. Well, I don't know all the dependencies beforehand. I don't know them beforehand because I need to run some command in order to compute more dependency. And like you could imagine representing that in the rule, like you could have a two-stage rule, right? Where like a first step is running something that gives you the actual concrete list of dependency. But if you try to do the code this way, it's a little bit, it's not great to use basically. It's also hard to share part of the, to share code because when you generate all these rules, a lot of them are very similar. You can share a lot of intermediate results. And that's where things such as applicative, etc., they provide a nice way to encode this. So I'm going to show you more precisely like how this works. So inside Gin, you have this build.t selective. So if you look at the code right now, it's not a selective because originally, well, 2 years ago, they didn't exist selective. So I used something called arrows, which is a bit similar to applicatives, but the ideas are the same anyway. So you have this thing, basically build.t, which represents a computation that when you evaluate this computation, yield the value of type alpha. But it's not run yet. And then you have various combinators to compose this build.t value and produce something more complex. On the build rule, in the end, it is simply a build.t that produces an action. And here I only said the action. There is also like the list of dependency on target. These are implicit in the build.t because in general, you just want to declare like your dependency, but you don't really do anything with them. So they are implicit in this build.t. And there are two ways we actually declare this dependency. So the first one is the simpler one. Basically, it's the one like the more powerful one. So you simply have like an alpha and an arbitrary set of dependencies. So for example, list of files or something under like your T, and this index kind of absorb this dependency set inside the build.t. That means that this thing alpha T, when you evaluate it and it produces an alpha, it will also produce this set of dependency here. And now we have a variant, depth, which is pretty much the same. If you look at the total, they are very similar, except that I have taken the set of dependency outside of the selective. These two things have pretty much the same effect. But now the only difference is that I know this set statically before running, before executing this build.t and getting the value, which means that I can find this dependency before running it. In practice, if you look at the code, in most places, like 99% of cases, you can use this rather than this. And when I first introduced this build.t in Vue, that's what I did. Basically, I rewrote the code, and I made sure to use this guy basically everywhere where I could use it. And by doing that, what it means that I can analyze pretty much all the graph, all my build. I still have the power of dynamic dependency, which I need, but I still can analyze pretty much everything. And by analyzing this graph, I can extract all my external dependency. Basically, I know statically that here I'm using an external library, so I register that, and at the end I can list this external dependency. And that's what I need for generating my package metadata.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I'm just not very fluent in OCaml.
Yeah.
The T is like that has a like it's come more from a Haskell background, so that would correspond to like a selective constraint on T. Yeah. That's the functor. T is the functor. Is that right?
T, so it's just a type name T. It's a type name that has a variable.
Yes.
Type constructor.
So yeah, type constructor. Yeah. So it would be like alpha list or like the list.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
I think so, but I don't understand when there's a depth.set.c.
Oh yes, sorry. This is just a qualified name basically. So like in OCaml, when a name starts with a capital letter, it's a module name basically.
But the .t, then it's a set consisting of t's, or the t is just
No,
a
it's
function.
it's the T that belongs to the depth set.
It's a convention in OCaml
Yeah.
to call the main type of the module T.
Yeah, they're just
Yeah.
So it reads set, it's like the set type.
Okay, yeah.
so this would be called like depth
But
underscore
it's
set, for
but set
instance.
is then a monomorphic type.
Yes, in OCaml, like sets are monomorphic. You have to apply a functor to get a new
Yeah.
type of sets.
The functor in OCaml is different from the functor in Haskell.
I believe so, yeah. It's mainly because when you talk about sets, you need an order, and you can't really attach an ordering function to a type. So what you do is that you create a new monomorphic type for every type of set you want to use.
And then you use factors.
Yeah. That's the idea.
The other T's there, sorry, are they just type parameters that are not bound to a specific?
Sorry, which one?
Yeah.
So this one is the same as build.t. I didn't write build.t because otherwise it was going on the other side.
Oh, yeah.
But basically, so when you are inside the build module, T will just like build.t will just be T, and when you access it from outside, you will write build.t. And then you can do open build, and that will bring all the name in scope, and you can just use T.
Also, in OCaml, the type parameter comes before.
Yeah, that's
itself,
also.
right? The order is reversed from us.
Yeah, yeah. I believe like it's. I'm not sure it might have been like the C convention, because when you write tab def in C, I'm not sure, but my guess is that it is where it comes from. So to come back to this, so the idea is that when you write your rule, like you basically essentially produce a lot of these values, which are computations that produce an action, a set of dependency on a set of targets. And you use various like way to compose them. And you will use this thing to declare your dependency. And you will, like the game is to use this as much as possible so that you can analyze most of your graph beforehand. And once you have done that, then that's it. You just have to run the first stage, like the first stage in here, basically generate the rule. And you have enough to scan most of your build graph, basically. And that's so that's essentially what I did. And it was quite quick to do this. Basically, it took me a couple of days. And just like that, I was able to generate my my OPAM files, like the package metadata for OCaml packages. And that was really nice, actually. Like JBuilder, it's what made the General public release really easy and smooth. Before it was painful. And this is one aspect that was really really nice as well. So by using this abstraction, basically, I won a lot of time. Yeah.
So the advantage of having it statically known is that that you don't, for example, to like memorize stuff, you don't have to run a service remembering, like for example, compile service or build service or something. Or what is the actual specific advantage of having a statically known?
Well, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem here. Basically, so initially, like I start from this polymer repo, then I extract some code, some libraries. So we put them in small logical packages. And then if I want to build these packages, they need to be built in order as well, right? Like if core depend on base needs to be built first before building core. And in order to know this ordering, you have to know the package dependency. You have to know that core depend on base. And once you have built everything, then effectively, like you have the full graph, you can just follow the graph and find the dependency. But in order to build, you do need the dependency. So you have to choose what you do first. And by knowing like this build graph without having to run any of the compilation, you can find this package dependency well before you run the build. So this way, and once you know the package dependency, then you can continue the build as usual. But
so this, my question is, could this be solved by having like a compile service that could just memorize the dependencies over time, and then you could then, when you rerun the build up against the service, then it remembered what the dependencies were from last time, for example?
Yeah, I suppose you could build it this way, but like then the problem is the first time, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But I suppose, in fact, when you write a makefile for OCaml, for an OCaml project, you do pretty much that. What you will do is that you will use OCaml deb to generate the dependency in a makefile format, and then you will commit this makefile in your repository, and you will use that for the next build. Like in particular, if you look at the OCaml compiler, that's how it does it. And that's why it's really painful, because when you modify your ML file, the dependencies are wrong. You get your build is completely corrupted, so you have to. It's most painful to deal with. But that's exactly this idea.
So it's like also because you have like so grand monorepo, you never want to have it slow the first time you run it.
Yeah, and also like the first time it's a bit difficult, right? Because like you can, if you don't have the dependency, like the best you can do is try to build everything, right? And see what works, etc. And like trying to build everything in a repo that has hundreds of thousands of files. Like building the whole repo, it takes I think half an hour, So yeah. On like in general, things that are stateful like this, like you have this service that remember things, they are a bit more difficult to work with over time. Like if the state is corrupt, do you restart again, etc. It's much simpler where the system, like when you can just start fresh, it just works. I think that's the more like functional way of thinking, I suppose. Yeah. All right. So what I showed you, like basically scanning this dependency graph here, I just choose like we could do it with an applicative, right? There is nothing really specific to selective. So why selective are useful? Well, when you have a build system, there is often places where you want to do you want to make choices at runtime. Like you might want to do something different depending on whether a library is installed or not, like a dependency is installed or not, whether like the user has a file or not, etc. So you have this case where you want to scan the whole graph beforehand because you want to, let's say if you do something differently, depending on whether a library is installed, this library is basically an optional dependency. So you do need to scan the part of the graph that uses this library and mark it as an optional dependency. But at runtime, you need to make a choice. So we are exactly in the case of selective, where we need to scan everything beforehand, but we need to make choice at execution. And so finally, just to come to the end of this talk, I've shown how, so I use selective in a build system for like the purpose of both generating a build and extracting metadata. But there are many other places where we can use selective. For example, another case where we want to use selective in Dune is the parser, so like the part of the program that read the JBuild files, so sorry, the Dune files, and interpret them. So currently it's written using a monadic parser, but we want to rewrite it using a selective parser, because if we can basically analyze our parser before giving it an input file, then maybe we can extract a grammar from this parser. And if we can extract a grammar, we can give it to the editor, which will give us editor support. Or we can use it to generate some documentation, some reference documentation of the language, etc. So there are many cases like this where, like by modeling what you do in this framework, you can get more out of it. You can get more for your money, basically. Just put a link. It's a blog post I saw recently on Twitter. So someone wrote a very nice blog post about applicative parsing. So it's quite similar, but if you are interested, I encourage you to read it. I think all these ideas are quite high by the moment, like they're quite nice. So us in Dune, we want to go a bit further because in our parser, sometimes we want to do choices. For example, people might use extension, so some part of the parser might be enabled or not, depending on some choice the user has made. But yeah, in general, so it was just to say that there are many cases where you can benefit from selective. It's just not just for this very special cases. So just to sum up a bit this talk, we have discussed how we can take selective functors, which are something that come on like the very mathematical side of programming. How I do that, how I applied it to a very concrete problem I had, how it made my life easier, you know, and I benefited a lot from it. How we can use it in other contexts. So if you want to know more, so if you want to know more about selective in OCaml, or you have more general OCaml question, I invite you to go on this forum, which is like the main forum where people talk about OCaml. Some people talk about selective there as well, so if you want to play with it, that's a good place to find resources and people to help. If you want to know more about GenStreet and open source at GenStreet, you can go on our open source website. There's a lot of information about all the things we release on open source. There are some links as well to GenStreet. If you want to apply, we're always looking to hear people. That's the end of my talk. If you have any more questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Should we get the engineer? So I actually have a question between your discussion with regard to memorization. So
the way I actually understand this thing with the selective applicative functors is that you have like statically on the pre-built stage, like a specification of what you want for this code files to become a library, right?
Yeah.
So if you rely on this dynamic stuff is afterwards, right? So it's when you try to build a package, but you are interested at the pre-build phase to get as many dependencies on place before you actually try to build a package. So I think you will actually have the same issue if you do memorization, right? Because memorization is you put a lot of stuff into memory and you just discover if it's there, if it's not there when you run it, right? If this gives sense. So like what you were saying was you can just use memorization. So memorization is just something that it's part of the application when it's running. It's not statically typed.
Yeah.
So it's depending on the values that you have run your function with that actually save that some kind of caching, right?
Yeah.
So it's more or less like using dynamic dependencies that you had, like the two examples.
So you couldn't memorize the dynamic ones because you don't know what they will return. You will only be able to memorize the ones that are static.
So why can you not memorize the dynamic ones?
Because I guess the reason why they're dynamic is that they can change from time to time.
Well, it's fully reproducible, right? Like they can change. Well, let's say if you generate an ML file, and the generation depends on some on the system, then effectively you won't get the same ML file everywhere, and you might not get the same dependency everywhere. Like in particular, you might generate an ML file that explicitly has different dependencies depending on like the context. Yeah. Like you might choose between two implementations, for instance. So yeah, if you memorize like, if you want to memorize like this, because we are thinking as well about memorization, you know, because we at the moment we are looking at sharing, you know, build artifacts between workspaces, between machines, etc. So that, for example, if you build something, you know, and your colleague want to build the same thing, then maybe you can just give your colleague the artifact rather than redoing the work. And when you start sharing things like this, you have to be really precise about what you are sharing, right? And what you need to do essentially is capture precisely the dependency, like what you needed to build this artifact, what it depends on, so that if you reuse the cached result, like a memorized result, you are sure you can reuse it. You know, like you are sure that whether you use the memorized thing or whether you rerun it fresh, you will get the same result. So you need to precise.
How can you be sure about that?
Well, there are several ways. So when you run a command, like the idea, you know, you have a build system and you run a command, you just don't know what the command is doing, right? It's like a black box, you run it. And after you have to specify it, you know, you declare the dependency, you declare the target, and you are trying to, in a way, to declare the effect of your command. And well, it's also possible to make mistakes. So after you can mitigate it by doing sandboxing, for instance. So instead of just like running your command in your build directory, you will run it in a smaller environment that has only what you think the command need, what the declared dependencies are. And this way, well, if you didn't declare your dependency correctly, then the command will just fail because it won't find what it needs. So you are kind of trying to protect a bit the execution to guide it. Yeah.
Did you show what the definition of a selective functor was?
I didn't.
Do you have it? Can we see it?
We can probably see it. I would have to go on the internet.
It's very confusing that this microphone is recording. I don't know.
Warwick can probably give him the browser. This is not his
Yeah.
So he probably does have no business.
I do have a browser.
I also remember the screen sharing stuff.
Basically, I assume that Simon covered all this in the last talk.
Yeah, he went very academic.
Yeah.
Math, so.
Yeah.
There you go.
You can see it.
Yeah. Oh, you can see it. That is a good point.
But he didn't get into selective functors. Simon.
Oh, at the Copenhagen thing.
Yeah, he
Right,
gave like a
the
couple of
Copenhagen-
talks, like academic, like
Oh, I
private
didn't
stuff.
see the. We didn't go there.
So he was
See it
like
now.
more theoretical and how they
Yes.
use it, like superficial level at Facebook, but this is more like
We're out of the loop, man.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry. How can this be? You're there.
It's magic.
And in a way,
It's also me failing very badly at this tool.
inception.
But I suppose what I wanted to show here is like really, how you use these things in real
Right.
programs. Because I guess when you program, you don't really think about using these things in general.
it's just I didn't go to the talk that you're referencing.
Ah, okay. So maybe I can show you like the OCaml library for selective functors.
But if it's only the two of us, then other people.
No, but I suppose it's
I mean, if you slack on the talks, it's not our problem.
I will. Some of us have work,
I suppose things like
But I mean,
like Monad, etc. Are people a bit more familiar with it? Like, do you know the way? Okay, so that's the OCaml one. So here, well, I don't have the complete definition because I'm importing some from applicative.basic, but do you have in mind what an applicative is? Like with return on apply. So selective, you are just adding this select function, which takes so like either an alpha, either a beta, and then a function just like apply, that an alpha beta t function. And the idea is that you can either feed like an alpha to this function, like during execution, you give it an alpha and it will give you the result. You run some code, you the result. Or you can give it a beta, like so write a b, and you don't need to apply the function to execute the function. So basically, you will feed your selective this pre-printed data just to see what it's doing, like what is underneath, to analyze your graph basically.
so it's more or less like a static path or
Yeah.
like a guessing path, like you say, this is where you can.
Yeah, like like running in a mock environment or something, I would say. So there are different ways, to you don't have to choose exactly select. There is a paper. So well, actually, the paper about selective functor, by Andrei Mokov, and well, Simon, myself, and another. So where there is a discussion about what you can use basically, and like the idea that select it's like in general you want to find the smallest set, right, of combinators. You need that is the more generic one, and select is basically a good choice.
So you were at the talk and Simon actually sent us like both slides, so it's on the meetup group. But one of the things I recall from him is that he says that the applicative selective functors doesn't comply with the laws that you expect for applicative. So
Hmm.
just so you have that in mind, I know you do ACT and Haskell and all that stuff, so there's something like they're missing. But again, it's like maybe not too late. We want to get that shot.
Yeah, in general, like the idea is that applicative, like if you follow properly the rules, when you execute it, you are supposed to follow and evaluate all the branches. While with selective, you have this choice of executing only one branch.
So I'm thinking with the select is alpha and the beta kind of, do they have different privileges kind of, because you need to have a function that can go from an alpha to a beta,
yeah.
But you don't need to have a function that can go from a whatever beta to an alpha or something. So they're kind of different.
Yeah, so here, I suppose here in this select, like alpha is like you are transforming an alpha to a beta basically, and you give the user the choice to either produce, like give the alpha t, either give like the evaluated like the result directly. But I suppose so that's like when you program a selective, you're not really going to use this select much. Basically, you're going to use like combinators that are derived from select, that are more like more convenient to use. Like branch, for example, or even if, like very simple if. So you give a bool t and then to alpha t, and it will evaluate like the first one if this evaluates to true, and the second one if this evaluates to false. So you could use, for example, if as a primitive, as an axiom. But then if you are doing that, it's not enough to do like to have maybe branch or one, etc. Well, if you select, you can define all these things in terms of select. That's why select is interesting. Yeah.
And so obviously the difference between just using an applicative for implementing if is that you would end up executing both applicative effects.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the difference.
I have a question. So here at SU, we have a microservice architecture where we do a lot of requests to other services. Mm. And when reading the paper on selective applicative functors, you mentioned that you could determine the minimum set of dependencies.
Yeah.
And I was considering, would you see that viable to use in a production setting where you get a request and you know for sure that you're going to use the smallest set of other requests that needs to be made, and then use selective to maybe extend that so you have a more declarative way of describing your interdependencies between the microservices. Does that make sense?
So I'm not super familiar with.
So say we get a request and we need to look up some user information. We need to look up some document information and some other microservices that we need to extract some information. Now, based on the results here, we might elect to do even more. But when I read the paper, I was thinking, is it possible? So it's easy to derive the minimum amount of work.
Yeah.
But it might extend.
When we select it effectively, you need to know everything beforehand.
So I need to know all the branching, right?
Yeah.
But in the if statement, the bool can change, right? It depends on some other computation.
Yeah. You will need to know, so let's say you want to do more requests, you will need to do what there are before, basically.
Yes.
You can't generate a completely new request, that you didn't know about before.
No, but I can generate the tree, right? And then I know the branching points.
Yeah.
So I can deduct the minimum set of dependencies without doing anything.
Oh, yes, you can deduct the one that you will need for sure. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And every time I know more, then I extend that set until complete.
Yeah, so that's the idea.
Thanks.
I think Simon.
I think what Simon Marlowe is using a selective functor for is exactly what you're talking about, finding the minimum number of asynchronous calls and doing them in advance.
Yeah.
So yes, you can do that.
But would it be more declarative? Would it look nice when I read the code?
Yes, because in Haskell they also hack the compiler as they always do, so that you can write do notation. And if you write do notation with where the control flow does not depend on monadic results, then they will desugar to applicative operations, not monadic operations. So it will look nice because yeah, and
actually,
if you
in
mess it up,
OCaml, we now have like the let notation for applicative monad, etc. So you can just write like let plus, and it's just like a let binding.
Not out yet.
But it's in for weight. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not released.
Yeah, no, I think the RC1 was released recently or something.
Yeah, RC1.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah, I'm part of the secret mailing list.
Any more questions? Well, I think we should give it again.